Welcome to Pickwick Monthly. I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And my Pickwickian co-host for today is Kevin Quinn. Hi, Kevin.
Hello, Ed. How are you?
Good. Welcome back. Kevin was our on the first number of Pickwick Monthly, and I'm happy to have him back for this one. Everyone, for 20 months, we are talking about Charles Dickens' The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, as it was first serialized in monthly parts from March 1836 to October 1837. Once a month, myself and one of a rotating set of co-hosts talk about each serialized part for 20 straight months. Along the way, I'll share some of the items in the Rosenbach's collections. There are complete serial issues of Pickwick Papers, a portion of the Pickwick manuscript. The Rosenbach has many first editions signed by Dickens, the earliest surviving literary manuscript of Dickens, lots of ephemera, letters, even a lock of Charles Dickens's hair. In today's episode, number 5, chapters 12 to 14, Mrs. Bardell in a Faint, Eatanswill Patriotism, and What the Queer Chair Said to Tom Smart. And we also have Sam Weller officially joining the Pickwickians. If you're watching live right now, please like and subscribe and have fun in the live chat. And if you're watching this recording, please also like and subscribe. And if you want to leave comments or questions, please do so, and I will get back to you. All right, Kevin, looks like you're still getting some things to getting all ready. You've got lots of stuff to talk about and share today. I know, me too. But first, we did your intro in the first time you were on, so people want to know who you are and your connection to Dickens and all that. They can go watch the beginning of that one. But today I want to talk about, as a way of intro, you mentioned you might want to talk about your first trip to London in 1993 and your Dickensian adventures then. When was that?
It was funny, too, because my in-laws, Ed, this is 93, my in-laws had been to London fairly recently to that time, and they really pushed hard. I said, I really want to see Ireland. So we did a 2-week trip, a week in Ireland, a week in London. And, I was trying to find a connection between what we're talking about today and that first trip of mine to London. And I think I found it in the fact that it was the first time we visited Sir John Soane's house, okay? And I always did love William Hogarth, who was a brilliant artist. He typically painted the scene, and then he would sell engravings, right? And he would charge some pretty hefty sums. They weren't published as part of any literature, Ed. They stood on their own, but you could buy the whole, a series of paintings. And one of the ones he did was entitled The Election. Mm-hmm. And it was purchased by Sir John Soane, whose house subsequently became a museum, but when he lived in it, that's pretty much what it was. Everything from an Egyptian sarcophagus to all types of artwork of his contemporaries. If you ever get to London, listeners, please try to get there. It's just astonishing. And at the time in 93, you were actually able to manipulate the paintings. And maybe we might talk a little more about that and slide them in and out of the clever way he had them hung so that he could fit like over 100 paintings in a space that could only really hold 30,
Well, I definitely want to talk about, and you'll share some images too, and talk about his election series. I love how Hogarth would make these series, the Rake's Progress. Did he do the series for Pamela? I can't remember. The Richardson novel? No, I don't think he did. Maybe someone else did that. But
let me see. I happen to have my etchings by Hogarth with me, so I can
do these series of paintings that would tell a story, and his election. It's three paintings. So then he would do engravings of and sell them. And it kind of tells the story of this election over the different scenes that he's creating, and they tie in very well with the Eatanswill election. That will
absolutely. I mean, some of the things he didn't do Pamela, but he did Samuel Butler's Hudibras was a big
Hudibras,
one,
yeah.
16.
Yeah.
A Harlot's Progress, a Rake's Progress. He did The 4 Times of the Day, Marriage a la Mode, Industry and Idleness, which Dickens Dickens at one point in his life took a tour of the British Isles, and they entitled it The Tour of Two Idle Apprentices, he and his friend, and he took that from this Hogarth.
And isn't the two, it's the Gin Lane, and then the other one's Beer
Street and Gin Lane.
And
Gin Lane was the inspiration for Sir Tom All Alone's. Fizz took inspiration for that dark print, later in Bleak House. But he always had some social satire in there. I say some. I mean, when you go into a Hogarth painting, you can get lost in there looking at the little details. For example, Fizz took inspiration with that dog that he inserted. If you look at the first plate with Sam Weller, there's a little dog nipping at the heels of Mr. Pickwick. That's not textual, Ed. It's not in the text. You know, that's something that, kind of got thrown in there. And Fizz was really a big reason why Dickens was so successful. They meshed well together. In many cases, some have observed that Fizz or Brown was the first critic. I mean, he got the text first, and many times he illustrated scenes from the books without any feedback from Dickens. Now, as they went on, they trusted each other more. There were times where Dickens said, hey, do a little more of this or that. But many times he just, the speed that they both worked at was astonishing. I mean, Fizz illustrated 1,603 illustrations for Dickens. He etched 490 steals for the 7 novels that are shown in this definitive book of Fizz's work for Dickens. He was only 21 years old in 1836, and they worked together for 23 years until A Tale of Two Cities. He averaged, by his own computation, and he wasn't only working for Dickens. I mean, Ainsworth, a lot of other Lever, a lot of other authors. He averaged 4 steals every 10 days during that period of time.
Well, it's interesting when he stops working with Dickens, when Dickens is doing his magazines and he's publishing his story in his magazines as serials without illustrations, but yet later after Dickens dies, Fizz does illustrations for Dickens for the household editions. So, and does he ever do illustrations for those ones that he didn't illustrate, like Tale of Two Cities or Great Expectations or Hard Times? Does he wind up doing illustrations for those, or does he just go back and do?
I don't know, Ed. I have to look into that. Today I focus mostly on Johansson's book, but that's interesting point. It even continued posthumously because I don't think he died till like 1880.
I'll share one later because he illustrates Dickens's the household edition of all of Dickens' works, and what he does is then illustrates of the 7 interpolated tales, or is it 9? How many is it?
I think 9.
9 interpolated tales in Pickwick. Only 4 have illustrations in the original, publication, and Fizz for the household illustrates the others. So the other 5. So
and you look, we're looking at Fizz early in his creative career. As his arc went on, his development sort of parallels Dickens. He gets better, he tries different things. And back to this book I'm talking about here, where he had all 5. This guy Johansson went out and broke up 66 first editions. I guess at the time you couldn't reproduce these images without actually breaking up the first edition. Probably today you could get in there with a camera and get a better image, right? But he broke up 12 Pickwicks, 15 Nicholas Nicklebys, 9 Martin Chuzzlewits, 9 David Copperfield, 7 Dombey and Sons, 6 Bleak's House, and 8 Little Dorrits, including one of those very rare 1938 editions of Pickwick, to come up with all 516 plates from the 7 Charles Dickens novels that are in this this book, and it took him from 1903 to 1956 to do so.
I mean, the old way to do things. Yeah, now you just, photograph the images, but he literally has to break up books to get clean copies of all the images. Yeah.
He's got to take that engraving out and actually take a photo of it.
All right. Well, we'll look at Fizz's 2 illustrations for number 5 today. And also, actually, just before we start talking about the story, I want to mention in number 5, this is my facsimile of the Easton Press facsimile from the 80s. But it's a perfect facsimile. And they went back, and each issue is the very first printing as well. So it has the Pickwick Advertiser as it appeared in all these. I took some photos of it. I want to share those and talk about them a little bit, because the Pickwick Advertiser now we saw it appear for the first time in issue number 4, but now it's also going to be in number 5. And in number 5, we go not just with books as it's in the other one, and all issues on the inside cover and the back cover had advertisements for books, but this is a different publisher. This is Kidd. This is William Kidd's books here that he's advertising in Bradbury, in Chapman and Hall, Hall's, periodical to sell his books. More here, Crookshank at Home. I want to talk about this in a second. But now there's also household goods. Silver, tea service sets, clocks, watches, more books here. But in the back of this issue, in a fold out, we have Roland's Macassar oil in a fold out advertisement. So it's like an 8x11 folded in, and then you fold it out for the last page to have, and it's actually a 2-page advertisement. It's on both sides of the paper, all one big ad for Macassar oil, the cure-all for every hair need possible. Basically, it's just like grease you put in your hair. It has no benefits. You're not growing hair because of it, as they claim, or your hair's not healthier. It's just you're oiling up your hair. People couldn't, was bathing, washing hair every day if they needed it, was not thing to do. So you have to just grease it all and hold it in place. And hence Macassar oil, hence people may know of anti-Macassars. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, Macassar, but anti-Macassars are something you would put on the back of your furniture because people would have their hair, and then it would keep the oil off of the furniture. So this is the originator of this, the reason they had to make all those doilies to put on the backs of sofas and chairs. So but here's the interesting part. Here's what I really want to talk about right here. In this, whoops, that's not right. Let me go back to these William Kidd books. William Kidd was a publisher, just published the following interesting works. And I saw this, and it's the Book of Books, or London as it is and as it ought to be. And then I look in here, engravings by George and Robert Crookshank and the late Robert Seymour and G.W. Bond. And I'm like, oh, I want to see what this is. I look it up. I couldn't find out a free copy online, in Google Books or anything like that. But I'm really interested to see what this is. And then on the other page, we have Crookshank at Home. And I'm like, oh, what is that? I hadn't heard of that. And it says illustrations by Crookshank. That's it. Just one word. Okay. And it is apparently not George Crookshank, but his brother, Robert. And what had happened was, early on, Kidd had published a very early book with George Crookshank, and had some of his illustrations in it. And then every time after that, he kept telling people he was publishing Crookshank, and it was his brother, Robert. But he would put just Crookshank because George, one of the brothers, was so famous, and Robert wasn't so famous. He's not nearly as good of an artist as George was, and wasn't famous, but he would constantly use it. And with this at-home series, especially, George Cruikshank got really angry. Even Robert got angry. Robert's annoyed because he didn't want people thinking he was trying to capitalize on his brother's name. He had no say in the way these books were advertised by Kidd, and through a series of letters and actually through a little bit of legal action, George Cruikshank is trying to get him to stop doing it. This is all, and it doesn't work. And then there's another here's his only revenge that he gets. Where is it? Here it is. A chapter of noses. This is published. This is George Cruikshank, and it's published. It was from, this is the original drawing, and it's from his book, My Sketchbook, that he published in 1834. Okay, Pickwick is 36. And this picture here, most approved, let me zoom in a little bit here. The most approved method of pulling a fellow's nose, published by George Cruikshank, who particularly requests that his friends and the public will observe that he has no connection with the works put forth by Mr. Kidd of Chandos Street, except The Gentleman in Black, published some years ago, and that is the only transaction he ever had or ever intends to have with the aforesaid Mr. Kidd, the publisher of Chandos Street, West Strand. And this is his own self-portrait of himself, and this is William Kidd. This is his picture of Kidd here. This is 1834. He's making fun of him, telling people he has no association with him. He's trying to get Kidd to stop. He can't. And sure enough, 1836 in Pickwick Papers, and Cruikshank has already illustrated for Dickens as well. He does his illustrations for sketches by Bose. Here is still Kidd saying these book with original illustrations by Cruikshank, and it's not George Cruikshank. He's still doing it and has not stopped. So I thought that was interesting that Kidd's got the temerity to still be doing this years after both brothers have told him to stop. He doesn't care. He's selling books. That's his only concern. Let me stop the share here. And this is 2 years later, and he's still doing it. And there's no way that, Cruikshank's ever going to get him to stop. William Kidd was known as, a pirate publisher too, that he would publish whatever he wanted and not, give credit to people what they deserved it, or in this case, tell people it's one Cruikshank when it's really not. And some of those, it could be like one Robert Cruikshank illustration in it in some of these books, and then the rest are other people, or just like cheap wood engravings of other things. But he would just say it's by Cruikshank, and then there you go. And he hoping to sell, and I'm sure it worked. So I wonder if there were any issues with Cruikshank then goes on to illustrate Dickens's next serial, Oliver Twist, and I wonder if there were any conversations about Kidd in those. So hey, don't take any advertisements for Kidd was Bentley's miscellany. The
quid pro quo. Yeah.
So all right, I just thought that was fascinating because it's in the Pickwick Advertiser for number 5. And I always want to show some of those images. Some of the later copies that we have made available that are from the University of Victoria's library, they're PDFs of their original serial. Some of those later ones will have the actual Pickwick Advertiser in it, but the ones up to number 5 don't yet. And as I mentioned before, people wondering why are these somehow defective issues in a sense. No, actually, what would happen is the first run would have the Pickwick Advertiser, and sometimes the later runs, especially as the serial is becoming more popular, as time goes on, and they have to reprint earlier issues. Well, they're not necessarily going to give people this free advertising on their reprintings. They paid for the one advertisement in the earlier printings. They're not going to keep reprinting them, later. I think, so some of the later issues wind up not having the Pickwick Advertiser in it. So, but the first run did. All righty. On to the issue. Chapter 12. Chapter 12, descriptive of a very important proceeding on the part of Mr. Pickwick, no less an epoch in his life than in this history. And yet, as we talk about this and go through it, no spoilers, Kev, because we don't know why this incident is so important, but it will turn out to be. So
doesn't that kind of argue against this notion that it wasn't organized or it was completely episodic? And
I'm sure this is clearly an instance where this is something that he's planting and he wants to come back to. So this is one of those things, but we know for sure that, and even from Dickens talking about it later, that he was not planning this whole thing out. Okay. This isn't the point of it. Well, and we will get that with his next book, Oliver Twist. Well, we won't get to it because we're also not going to do 20 months will be enough. But with Oliver Twist, he's definitely planning that story ahead. But you can see by the end of that novel, he didn't plan at all because he's got to tie it together. So and this person's related to this person and this person, and it becomes a little silly by the end, all the connections that he has to make with people to make the story hang together, that he didn't think of those ahead of time. So it's not till later. It's not till Dombey that he really starts planning, is with Dombey and Son. All right. Here we have Mr. Pickwick in his apartments in Goswell Street. Did you go to Goswell Street have you ever gone to? Just the street? There's not there. I don't think there's a Pickwick mention on Goswell, is there?
No, I haven't. And it's actually, I believe it's changed names. It's not Goswell Street.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought it was still Goswell.
It's a different, I'm not prepared. I don't have it at my fingertips.
Okay.
There was a change. There was a change.
And Pickwick is there now in his apartments now, and we saw him briefly there before he took the cab to go to out to the Dingley Dell. And here he is in his sitting room, and we get a description of his living quarters, sitting room, first floor front, and his bedroom, second floor front.
Of course, first floor to us would be ground floor. To him, it's second floor.
Yep.
Right. So he's up
what
there.
That enables him to do is that he has windows, right? And he can look out, contemplating human nature in all its numerous phases it exhibits in that not more populous than popular thoroughfare. So front and back of the house, he gets to do this. No, front and the top two floors, he gets to do this. So one, he's got his dressing glass, and the other, he can look out the window at everybody. He has a landlady, Mrs. Bardell, the relict and sole executrix of a deceased custom house officer. Not the first widow in this serial part, and certainly not the only widow. I'll talk a little bit about widows in Dickens when we get to Tom Smart's story. But she is a widow, and this is the way she can earn a living as a widow, because she has inherited this property. And remember at the time, if you're a single woman, you can't own things. You have no legal authority. Everything has to come through the men in your life. If there are no men in your life, it becomes very difficult. But women who were married can do this. So there's a legal difference there for widows in Victorian society, or 19th century society. I constantly say Victorian with this, and we're technically a year away from Queen Victoria, right?
We're on the cusp of
37 or 38. When is she? She's very soon, but technically,
right,
we're not there yet.
Right.
But it's very much the same kind of, the first couple decades of her reign are still very much the same time. Culturally, cleanliness and quiet reigned throughout the house, and in it, Mr. Pickwick's will was law. Oh, I also mentioned there's no children or servants, no servants, no fowls in the house, no chickens running around. She runs a clean place here, but there is a child, and that is her own child, a small boy. And also a large man, who, He just comes and goes.
Do we ever hear about the large man
I
again?
don't think ever again.
I think there was a seed that didn't sprout there. I find that puzzling that he says no children, and then he goes on to say, talk about Master Bardell. Was there a child was considered very small, like not walking yet, or
it's just that there's no children residence, like nobody rents it. It's like, and she's not allowing that. Maybe like if you come with children, she's not going to rent for you. She just rents to older gentlemen. So, he is planning his journey to Eatanswill, and is walking around his room with manifestations of impatience, like he's waiting to do something. And Mrs. Bardell doesn't know what's going on with him. And we'll do a little back and forth in a little bit with this dialogue in a little while later. But at first, it's just Pickwick then starts asking her questions, right? Do you think it a much greater expense to keep two people than to keep one? And Mrs. Bardell, la, Mr. Pickwick, said Mrs. Bardell, coloring up to the very border of her cap, as she had fancied she observed a species of matrimonial twinkle in the eyes of her lodger. La, Mr. Pickwick, what a question. So we don't know, the reader doesn't know in the first reading yet what he's asking her, but she automatically thinks, ooh, keep two people, do you mean us, the two of us together here? And he keeps misunderstanding her, and she keeps misunderstanding him, obviously, because he hasn't told her what he wants, the question. Instead of just asking her a question outright, he beats around the bush and asks these other questions. He says, the person I have in my eye, here he looked very hard at Mrs. Bardell, I think possesses these qualities and has more of a considerable knowledge of the world, a great deal of sharpness. She thinks he's complimenting her. And then she says, or he says, he never mentioned it till I sent your little boy out this morning. And she thinks he sent the boy out to get him out of the way so he can, of course, ask me to marry him. And it just, to not read the whole thing, but it is so carefully worded by Dickens, and really, for me, kind of a brilliant in its way in the construction of this funny scene. Whenever you try to explain funny, then it's not funny. So I try to avoid that, but he really does. He really walks the tightrope carefully, so that they're constantly misunderstanding each other with every question and response given. And I really love that about this. She says, "Oh, consideration for my loneliness," and he's like, "I never thought of that," But he's thinking like, "Yes, of course. When I'm in town, you'll have somebody here with you. Not with me. It'll be you with." And what he's talking about is, now it's Sam Weller. He wants to ask her if it's okay to have a servant, if she thinks that would be a good idea in their house. And then finally, without more ado, she rose from her chair and flung her arms around Mr. Pickwick's neck with a cataract of tears and a chorus of sobs. God, read Pickwick there.
Bless my soul, from Bless My Soul?
Yeah, I'll read her, you read him.
Bless my soul, cried the astonished Mr. Pickwick. Mrs. Bardell, my good woman, dear me, what a situation. Pray consider, Mrs. Bardell, don't, if anyone should come.
Oh, let them come, exclaimed Mrs. Bardell frantically. I'll never leave you, dear, kind, good soul. And with these words, Mrs. Bardell clung the tighter.
Mercy upon me, said Mr. Pickwick, struggling violently. I hear someone coming up the stairs. Don't, there's a good creature, don't. But entreaty and remonstrance were alike unavailing, for Mrs. Bardell had fainted in Mr. Pickwick's arms. And before he could gain time to deposit her on a chair, Master Bardell entered the room, ushering in Mr. Tupman, Mr. Winkle, and Mr. Snodgrass.
With Mrs. Bardell in his arms. I love this landlady next part. They in their turn stared at him, and Master Bardell in his turn stared at everybody, and then he attacks. The impression that his mother must have suffered some personal damage pervaded his partially developed mind, and considering Mr. Pickwick as the aggressor, he set up an appalling and semi-earthly kind of howling, and butting forward with his head, commenced assailing that immortal gentleman about the back and legs with such blows and pinches as the strength of his arm and the violence of his excitement allowed. And here's where we'll see the Fizz illustration. This was the first one that he did for this. Let me line it up here. And here it is. And we'll zoom in a little. Whoops. There they are. She's fainted in his arms around her. Mr. Pickwick looking very, mortified here, caught in this position. I love their looks, like shock and, puzzlement. And this is a very knowing look right here. I can't remember who was who here now.
So Johansson writes, in the first plate, because there were actually 3 plates of this, Ed, plate A1, A2, and plate B, which was done for the 1838 bound volume. But in the first, Johansson writes, in the first plate, Mr. Tupman's satisfaction at having a comeback for his own earlier amatory defection is clearly shown. So yeah. Tupman's there, and he's kind of looking like, okay, here's some justice here in the universe. But Snodgrass and Winkle show their dismay. In plate 12B, the one that he did in 1938, Ed, they're all kind of smirking, right? Everybody's got and he writes in plate 12B, Snodgrass and Winkle, as well as Tupman, show their schadenfreude.
Well, in the first one, it's just Tupman here looking very, smug that now he's caught Mr. Pickwick in the same position that he was in. And here's the little boy kicking away here.
So if you can see this.
No, that's not going to show up.
Not really. Well, in the 1838 edition, Fizz inserts a painting of a voluptuous woman reclining, getting shot by an arrow with an arrow from Cupid above the mantle, right up there. And also he has a clock there. See right to the left of Pickwick's head. That's a clock with Father Time holding a sigh.
How about that?
So it's kind of like, what's this old man doing? This old guy's got no business doing that. Again, more Hogarthian commentary in the illustrations.
I'm going to have to look those up for future ones that we do here to see this kind of development in Fizz, in changing illustrations as time goes on. So, well, Pickwick is suspected by his friends. He says, I cannot conceive, what's the matter with the woman? Very extraordinary thing. Very, said his 3 friends. Place me in such an extremely awkward situation. Very, was the reply of his followers, as they coughed slightly and looked dubiously at each other. This behavior was not lost upon Mr. Pickwick. He remarked their incredulity. They evidently suspected him. So, but he's saved by Sam Weller. He saved this embarrassment by Sam Weller entering the scene.
Would I be saying too much if I mentioned the next line? There is a man in the passage now, said Mr. Tupman. And dear readers, keep that in mind.
Okay.
He's in the passage.
All righty. Sam Weller comes in, forthwith presented himself. He deposited his old white hat on the landing outside. I love that he puts his hat just on the floor outside the door, as maybe people would do that. Excuse me, then just put their hat on the floor before they went into a room. But anyway, it's all beat up. It's got lots of holes in it, and he's got a great name for it. He calls it ventilation gossamer. I calls it his own special hat. And then we get, of course, a Wellerism. I'll let you do the Wellerism. Mr. Pickwick says, "Now, with regard to the matter on which I, with the concurrence of these gentlemen, sent for you," said Mr. Pickwick.
"That's the pint, sir," interposed Sam. "Out with it," as the father said to the child when he swallowed a farthing.
Out with it
being a farthing, which was a quarter of a penny, right? It was kind of a proverbial expression. I don't have a farthing. I don't have any. I'm down to my nothing. I got nothing here.
Out with it, as the father said to his child when he swallowed a farthing. So that becomes a real famous one. I see that quoted everywhere as a Weller. It's a perfect Wellerism, So it's the out with it, meaning like say what you need, but when it's the father saying it to his son who has swallowed a coin, it's out with it because I want that coin back. So that's the humor of a Wellerism, everybody, and a perfect example of it. Well, Mr. Pickwick wants to hire him, and he does, wages, 12 pounds a year, clothes, 2 suits, work to attend upon me and travel about me with these gentlemen here. And, Sam says, absolutely. And then the chapter ends. Mr. Pickwick has to check his references, and with the single exception of one amiable indiscretion in which an assistant housemaid had equally participated, the history of Mr. Weller's conduct was so very blameless. She equally participated. Let's say that.
And they were on equal footing. There was no power imbalance, both being servants, right?
As we'll see later in this. Mr. Weller was furnished with a gray coat with a PC button. I like this, that even the manservant of a Pickwickian gets a PC button, a Pickwick Club button. A black hat with a cockade to it, a pink striped waistcoat, light breeches and gaiters, and a variety of other necessaries too numerous to recapitulate. I was looking up. I was trying to find a really good illustration of Weller with the black hat, the cockade in it, PC button. They're really hard to find. I couldn't find any with everything. Most illustrations of him from the Victorian age still have him with the old beat up white hat, like very few kind of updated. Now he's updated by Fizz later and he's in here and all that kind of thing. But the pink striped waistcoat is often in the illustrations of him, but it's still with the hat. And actually the pink striped waistcoat comes now. It's not when he's in the yard, right? But
okay. Right.
So it's, but I wanted him with the PC button, but I couldn't find one of him with the PC button. So we'll talk about your button later. We can't see it yet, but you've got a button to show us later. But Sam's got a PC button, and he wonders whether I'm meant to be a footman or a groom or a gamekeeper or a seedsman. I looks like a sort of compo of every one of them. So never mind, that's okay. So long life to the Pickwicks, says I. That sounds like a good toast there. Long life to the Pickwicks, says I.
Hear, hear. And this chapter is very dramatic, isn't it? I mean, it could really be easily played upon the stage. I mean, he's even giving you the costume directions here. It's like something out of a Rossini opera,
As it always does. I mean, he sets the stage frequently in the beginning of a chapter, especially in a new scene. Dickens sets it just like a theatrical production. Our scene opens. It's like the curtain goes up and you see, and he describes the scenery and the stage set. And then as each character comes in, he describes their costume. And So theatrically minded he is in writing, always, and it never goes away. Well, here we are, chapter 13, some account of Eatanswill, of the state of parties therein, and of the election of a member to serve in Parliament for that ancient, loyal, and patriotic borough. So they are that, huh? Well, I love the coy way that the narrator, Dickens, the narrator, sets this up, right? We will frankly acknowledge that up to the period of our being first immersed in the voluminous papers of the Pickwick Club, we had never heard of Eatanswill. We will with equal candor admit that we have in vain searched for proof of the actual existence of such a place at the present day, knowing the deep reliance to be placed on every note and statement of Mr. Pickwick's, and not presuming to set up our recollection against the recorded declarations of that great man, we have consulted every authority bearing upon the subject to which we could possibly refer. We have traced every name in schedules A and B, I'll get to what they are in a moment, without meeting with that of Eatanswill. We have minutely examined every corner of the pocket county maps issued for the benefit of society by our distinguished publishers. I'll get to that too. And the same result has attended our investigation. We are therefore led to believe that Mr. Pickwick, with that anxious desire to abstain from giving offense to any, and with those delicate feelings for which all who knew him well know he was so eminently remarkable, purposely substituted a fictitious designation for the real name of the place in which his observations were made, which is Sudbury. Eatanswill is almost certainly Sudbury that Dickens had visited and reported from, but he had reported from several places in his career. But a couple of the notes in there I want to get to. The schedules A and B refer to when they were trying to reform these and I'll get to this in a bit too, these kind of rotten boroughs and pocket boroughs. They came up with lists for places that needed to be reformed, and that was Schedule A and Schedule B. Matter of fact, there's a note in my Mark Wormold note in my Penguin that maybe explains it a little more succinctly. The 1832 Reform Act contained two lists of rotten boroughs or those which had become either too insignificant in terms of population or too susceptible to the influence of one or two local property owners to warrant their existing levels of representation. 55 boroughs on Schedule A lost both members of Parliament. 30 boroughs in Schedule B lost one of their two members. And this is kind of what this means to be a rotten borough or a pocket borough. Rotten boroughs where the population is shrunk so small, but yet that borough was still by royal charter granted 2 members of Parliament. So it was very easy for rich people, landowners around there to control who gets elected. They would just choose someone and they would do whatever that landowner wanted. It was because they had such a small population. And in the other ones, in pocket boroughs, it winds up being someone who owns so much of the land that all the tenants are beholden to him. So then he controls everything, and they get 1 seat, but it's basically whoever he wants, and everybody has to vote for this person, and because they all
and they sold the seats.
Yeah, and they would sell them.
Right, flat out bribery. Hey, you want to be a member of Parliament? Give me £10,000 and you're in.
So they would so the Reform Act happens in 1832, and this is Pickwick, remember, is set in 1827. So Dickens is purposefully setting it before these places have been reformed. And it's a little note from the narrator to clue people in on what's going on. That the fact that he mentions schedules A and B,
right,
is where I'm looking for this place called Eatanswill, is a way to get people to know, oh, you mean it was one of those places.
Gotcha. You know, and that my Penguin says that the Schedules A and B are the official names for the forms of return applicable severally to the various classes into which sources of taxable income are divided. But what's your source? Because your source makes so much more sense, because when I read that note, Ed,
Yeah.
it just didn't tie in.
This is the newer Penguin by Mark Wormald,
Okay.
WORMALD, which came out. His notes are to 1999.
Right. Well, right on. I mean, that's mine's ancient. I'm from 1975.
All righty. Well, there's some research to do there for me to find out if they're maybe both of those equations are correct. Maybe they used those schedules A and B for that, and then used the same schedules to figure out the boroughs because of the number of voters. You know what I mean? It might be the same thing.
Right. Somehow might be related.
But the other note here is that in trying to look for this place, the narrator says, we have minutely examined every corner of the pocket county maps issued for the benefit of society by our distinguished publishers, the publishers of Pickwick Papers in the serial. And yes, this is from, let me share this picture here. This was just in what issue was it, in number 3 or number 4? This was in number 3, this advertisement, maps of the English counties, from Chapman and Hall, that you could buy. And here are all the counties. Now this is, so literally Dickens making a reference to something his own publishers sell, which had already been advertised in one of the earlier numbers of the thing. And we talk about product placement.
Holy product placement.
I mean, this advertisement should have made it into number 5. And did it? And did I just miss it? I don't think it did. And I think that's why I went to number 3 to find it, but I'm just 100% making sure here. Yes, it didn't. They advertise other things in number 5, but they don't advertise their county maps, which is map of the world and the new map of Europe, but they didn't do their county maps in this issue. But they had already advertised them. So there you go. I find that fascinating, and that idea of, I mean, it's product placement in serial works. This is a work of fiction that people are reading that contain advertisements for goods and services in the beginning and the end. And this whole idea of, this kind of commodification, this what's happening in Dickens' society, with the development of capitalism and goods and services and all these goods being available to people, and how goods kind of raise you in class if you can afford to buy certain, goods and services. It plays a lot into the way Dickens's novels work as well. But for the reader, the first readers of them in these serial editions, they're reminded of it constantly by seeing advertisements.
And also travel, like, this notion of the Cockney sportsman going out of London into the countryside. Hey, he can get a map here, stick it in his waistcoat pocket, and go out and find the right roads.
Yeah. Well,
obviously, if you lived there, you didn't need the map, Ed, right? So, this was for a whole new emerging middle class that had time and leisure to go and look at country homes or do the things that people with time and money can do.
Yes. All right. Well, also at the end of this, we have Mr. Pickwick's notebook. He mentions that he got on the Norwich coach. And then this entry was afterwards lined through as if for the purpose of concealing even the direction in which the borough is situated, which I think is funny. But it's probably Sudbury. Early on, people thought maybe he was writing about Ipswich, which he had also been, and he had just covered Ipswich election too as a reporter, but he had also covered Sudbury. He had covered other places as well, covering elections. And I'll a little bit more on this later. There's a couple letters that Dickens wrote that Kevin and I will read a little later when we get to the election scenes with his own witness details, and we'll see how close they are to the things that he's writing about in here. But Sudbury's pretty certain, and it's Sudbury and Ipswich and Bury St. Edmunds are all close to each other. It's like a little triangle there, and we'll get to Bury St. Edmunds soon in the next part. They wind up going there. But Sudbury even was so proud of this, even though it's painting this picture of the way, well, but it's also the way their elections used to be, not anymore. Sudbury was so proud of it that there was even an Eatanswill club that was set up in the early 20th century, and they would publish their own newsletter called I think it was the Eatanswill Gazette. It might still even be published. I'm not even sure. I have to check the Dickensian Fellowship News to see if the Eatanswill Gazette is even still published. But the Eatanswill Club, and so they're very proud of the fact that Dickens used their place as, and we'll get to the inn that he gets to. Is I'll show a picture of that when it used to exist. Almost all the inns that you get visited in Dickens novels were real inns. Sometimes he changes the name, as he'll do in this case. Sometimes he doesn't. Well, the town here, the Eatanswill people, every man in Eatanswill, conscious of the weight that attached to his example, felt himself bound to unite heart and soul with one of the two great parties that divided the town, the Blues and the Buffs. Whenever the Buffs and Blues met together at public meeting, town hall, fair, or market, disputes and high words arose between them. There were blue shops and buff shops, blue inns and buff inns. There was a blue aisle and a buff aisle in the very church itself. And there were even two newspapers, the Eatanswill Gazette and the Eatanswill Independent. The Gazette was blue and the Independent was buff, and they would publish, read some of their headlines there, some of their leading articles.
Such leading articles and such spirited attacks. Our worthless contemporary, the Gazette, that disgraceful and dastardly journal, the Independent, that false and scurrilous print, the Independent, that vile and slanderous calumniator, the Gazette. These and other spirit-stirring denunciations were strewn plentifully over the columns of each in every number, and excited feelings of the most intense delight and indignation in the bosoms of the townspeople.
So for blue and or buff and blue and buff, my first reaction when I was reading this now was like, wait, what color's buff? And I looked it up, and it's obvious. It means, and it's where we get the phrase "in the buff," because it's kind of a, maybe a skin tone for, especially for white people living here. But it's like a dull light yellow, blue and the buff. And the blue, though, is the color for the Tories, right?
Blue represents the Tory interests, and buff represents the Whigs. I didn't find any textual evidence, because I went back and I did a close reading of the chapter, Ed, just to, first of all, what are the principles that they advocate? There really aren't any principles. We're talking about the erection of a giant pump. I mean, this from the guy that went on to write about Master Bates, right? But, there isn't any policy in here, putting a cover on the marketplace,
there's not.
You can't really trace out in this chapter any Tory principles or any reform Whiggishness. It's really just interchangeable, the language on either side.
Dickens is pretty clear throughout this in representing both sides, that neither, they're just for their side, and that's all. They're not really for any particular serious differences. They just represent different people. But the way that starts too, very beginning here, when I was reading every man in Eatanswill, let's remember, they're not talking about the women. Well, we do in one sense, and we'll find out this tactic in a bit, this political tactic with the women, but it's just the men who can vote, and not even all the men. It is, not to the Reform Act of 32, and then later Reform Acts when they start to expand, those who can vote.
So you used to have in the 18th century, Ed, I understand, 40 shillings, right? So you had to have £2, and that entitled you as a man of property to vote. So that, I think that was part of the reason why they pushed so much money out there, right? Because they had to get that money into the hands of people that might not have had it to be able to bring them in on election day and have a vote your way.
And what we'll see later, when we share these Hogarth paintings, which are from 1755, something like that.
So 1754, and they're parody the 1754 Oxfordshire election, which was notorious for bribery and corruption.
So this kind of system has been going on for 80, 90 years. And Dickens is still covering elections in the 1830s, where things are still the same. This is the same kind of political factionism that has happened to England, and you can look at America then too, and it was so factional those early days. But even the newspapers here, and I love this, how they're the newspapers represent their own interests, and you can find this true always, that newspapers will back political parties, and in this case it is, but it is just to the extreme in this case that they are. But it also lets us know that this is a modern politics where media is just as important in influencing politics as anything that happens in politics. Like anything that a politician might do, it's just as important to swaying the crowd, swaying the vote, gaining and maintaining their power, are the media organs behind them.
Oh, absolutely. But the one thing I think that's changed a little in our time topically is, they're attacking the other paper, Ed. They're not attacking the people that read the other paper. They're making a distinction. And in their speeches later on, they talk about how, the people that live in the town are obviously the greatest, most enlightened, they're both sucking up to the crowd, whereas today there's almost a nastiness that wasn't there, that, the other side, God forbid, if they get elected, the world's going to end, so I think it's a little bit nastier today. They seem to be focusing on the papers and attacking the Gazette or the Independent. Respect.
We have our candidates here. Our candidates are the Honorable Samuel Slumkey of Slumkey Hall, was the blue candidate, and Horatio Fizkin Esquire of Fizkin Lodge near Eatanswill had been prevailed upon by his friends to stand forward on the buff interest. The Gazette warns us that the eyes not only of England, but of the whole civilized world were upon them. This tiny little town is, and it's part of Dickens' satire here. It's like, it doesn't matter, the world, and you're not affecting anybody. It's all your own self-interest. But I'm looking at it here too, because it's Slumkey of Slumkey Hall and Fizkin Esquire of Fizkin Lodge. So they're clearly landed people. They're rich men who own at least a house and some kind of estate. I wonder if there's a difference between honorable and esquire that I'm not catching there, a kind of distinction, that Slumkey Hall, Fizkin, they both have places named after them. I think they must be alike. And that difference in title, one's honorable, one's esquire, is the same thing, right?
I would think. And I mean, look, this notion of the Tories, being conservative and the Whigs being more progressive sort of held, but it didn't always map exactly so. For example, in that 1754 election in Oxfordshire, it was the Duke of Marlborough. Certainly, he had Blenheim Palace. It was the largest, a private residence in England, who was backing the Whig candidate. So there were sort of nuances that went on regionally. But in general, the Whigs were seen as taxing you more and being more progressive towards reform, whereas the Tories were running on less taxes and we want to keep things as they are.
And So there we go. So there are, and they go to the Town Arms Inn to stay. And let me, though, before we get into the Town Arms Inn, take this moment to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Dickens lovers worldwide. And I want to thank everybody who has donated already in this series to the Rosenbach or become members. If you'd like to donate, you can go to donate to the Rosenbach. You can do so on our website. You can also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website, and membership makes a great gift as well. There are lots of great in-person virtual programs and courses at the Rosenbach. We're still doing some behind the bookcase presentations in the summer, and in the fall, we'll come up with even plenty more for you to come and or virtually to watch online. You can also join us on Facebook. We have a Facebook group page, Pickwick Monthly, for lots more in which we post lots of info and news and links and conversation. It's a lot of fun on the Facebook group. And remember, you can write to me at epettit@rosenbach.org. And if you do, I may share your questions or comments on this segment right now called the Corresponding Members of Pickwick Monthly. I have just one to share this time, and it's from Henrietta J., who always writes after the shows, and she sends me all these, a whole letter full of notes after each show with lots of interesting info. And two of the things that really caught my attention in the letter after last episode were this. She wrote, "Curious that Pickwick's fury erupts and he hurls an inkstand. Is this the power of pen over the sword?" She says, "I watch the references to writers and their tools when reading Dickens, much as you look for pipes and tobacco." I do wind up looking for pipes and tobacco always, but that is interesting that, to look for references to writers and the tools of writing. And Dickens would have been very aware of that stuff. Henrietta also wrote, and I had commented on the last show about all the convivial eating and drinking in this book, right, Kevin? I mean, everybody is, and it's so joyful in this. And Henrietta wrote, "The word companion is from Latin, to break bread together." I don't think I knew that. And she wrote, "The food and drink are basic to the wellness of friendships and family. Someone counted in this book 35 breakfasts, 32 dinners, 10 lunches, 10 teas, 8 suppers, and 249 references to beverages." I love that. Thanks, Henrietta. I'd love to hear from all of you. So if anyone has a question or comment about the serial part for the month or just Dickens in general, don't hesitate to drop me a note at epettit, EPETTIT, @rosenbach.org. Thank you. Back to our serial part. Well, they go to the Town Arms Inn, and there are, large blue silk flags were flying from the windows of the Town Arms Inn. And there was a horseman in the balcony who was apparently talking himself very red in the face in Mr. Slumkey's behalf, but the force and point of those of whose arguments were somewhat impaired by the perpetual beating of 4 large drums, which Mr. Fiskin's committee had stationed at the street corner. And the Pickwickians are stuck in this mob of people. And here we'll go through this. You'll read Pickwick. I'll read the crowd and the other people. Okay, Kevin?
Yes, sir.
"Hurrah!" shouted the mob in conclusion.
"One cheer more," screamed the little fugal man in the balcony, and out shouted the mob again, as if lungs were cast iron with steel works.
"Slumkey forever!" roared the honest and independent.
"Slumkey forever!" echoed Mr. Pickwick, taking off his hat.
"No Fiskin!" roared the crowd.
"Certainly not," shouted Mr. Pickwick.
"Hurrah!"
Then there was another roaring, like that of a whole menagerie when the elephant has rung the bell for the cold meat.
"Who is Slumkey?" whispered Mr. Tupman.
I don't know, replied Mr. Pickwick in the same tone. Hush, don't ask any questions. It's always best on these occasions to do what the mob do.
"But suppose there are two mobs," suggested Mr. Snodgrass.
Shout with the loudest, said Mr. Pickwick.
Volumes could not have said more. That's such a great passage, huh? Shout with the largest. That's the, yeah.
And of course, the mob, Dickens has a horror of the mob.
But
right?
you're caught in the midst of it, sure. Shout with the largest and then get the heck out of there.
Yeah.
Well, that's what they do. They entered the house, and they were asked if they were blue, and Mr. Pickwick doesn't know, but he says, but he's there to meet Mr. Perker. And everybody remember, Mr. Perker was the lawyer of Wardle, who went to help them with Jingle running away with Miss Rachel. And he's the lawyer with the snuff that is then. So this is the connection with Eatanswill now, that Mr. Pickwick has met him and Perker has invited him to come out. And he asked if they know Perker, and he says, certainly, he's Slumkey's agent. He is blue, I think. Oh, yes, sir. Then we are blue, said Mr. Pickwick. So, because our friend is. And they're at the let's see. Oh, here's where I have my Rotten Borough information, but we already talked about it. So interesting that one of the reasons that these changes happen is because populations have changed so much, and they're getting very small. And this 1832 reform that has already happened at the time when this has been published, but hadn't happened when the novel is set, does make some headway, but it's not like the biggest reforms at all. I mean, once, especially because secret balloting still hasn't happened in England. So even if they take some seats away in other places, it could be still a smallish kind of population. Nobody's voting in secret. Nobody's submitting a ballot with their name on it. Everybody knows who you vote for. And that doesn't change until 1872, when the secret ballot was abolished. So, or when the secret ballot was set in place, that public voting was taken away. So these people who are voting here in this situation, and this plays in with the whole shout with the largest, because you might have to, for your literal physical, livelihood, if you don't join in with everyone else. So here there's at least two sides, but that's not always the case. So, all righty. They're at the Town Arms Inn. What Dickens had in mind, almost certainly, was a place called the Rose and Crown in Sudbury. The Rose and Crown, though, no longer exists. It burned down in 1922, but there are a couple images of it here. Here's one. Rose and Crown Hotel and Posting House. Also a motor garage. So this was clearly a later photograph. With Dickens, it would not have had that. But again, here's the carriage entrance, right? Here's where they drive the coach in. And it comes in here. And then if you go through, here's where it comes in. And it's a courtyard here. By the time this photo is taken, there's these kind of tables outside. And I like this. There's a kind of a glass roof that they've put over the courtyard here. I don't know how old this is, so I don't know if when Dickens, I doubt it was there when Dickens visited. But this, I imagine, enabled the place that this courtyard would be open in bad weather too, once they erected this over it.
They even refer to a new skylight for the marketplace when they're talking about the argument. So that's, I guess,
interesting. Yeah,
skylight the marketplace.
So, but this is what the Town Arms in Dickens's mind would have looked like, because he's basing it on the Rose and Crown, where he would have stayed there. So, all righty. Stop share. So were they blues? Perker's a blue, and then we get this, he meets Perker, and Pickwick wants to see sturdy patriotism on whatever side it is called forth. Sturdy patriotism is what we will see here. And, just when that line comes out, any patriot, noble, when these lines are coming out, honorable about these people, Dickens is clearly not, it's clearly being satirical about these people, especially because right after this, you get the description of some of the election tactics. This is sturdy patriotism for Perker. We have opened all the public houses in the place and left our adversary nothing but the beer shops. Masterly stroke of policy, that, my dear sir, eh? And he takes a large pinch of snuff. And Miss Pickwick's like, okay, I guess. Fizkin's people have got 33 voters in the lockup coach house in the White Hart. In the coach house, said Mr. Pickwick. Keep them locked up there till they want them, resumed the little man. The effect of that is, you see, to prevent our getting at them. And even if we could, it would be of no use. They keep them very drunk on purpose. Smart fellow, Fizkin's agent. Very smart fellow indeed. But he's got the coup here because Perker for Slumkey has given out 45 green parasols at 7 and 6 pence apiece to women. 45 women have gotten these green parasols. All women like finery, and it will secure their husbands and half their brothers' votes by getting those. And you even see them walking around the street. They're everywhere. I don't know about you, Ken, but I don't understand why he picked green for the parasols.
I don't know either. I mean, look, at the time, chemistry hadn't got as far. Maybe it was harder to dye a parasol blue. I don't know.
Green was actually popular then. I did some research.
Okay.
There was actually an article called 45 Green Parasols in the Eatanswill Election by Tycho Sakai in the Dickensian in 2020, just a few years ago. He talks about how Dickens showcases middle-class commodity. I was talking about it a little bit earlier. It's probably where I'm getting this from, middle-class commodity culture and, the fact that parasols and the green. And he also notes how green was actually a very fashionable color in the 1830s. And green had only become commercially viable or widespread to make a lot of green in the 1820s. So suddenly then it's very popular because it's newish. And so maybe that's Dickens's idea, but it should be blue. It doesn't make any sense to me that they're sending them out with they would send them out with blue. That would have made the statement. I can't imagine Dickens is just being so realistic about it by saying, oh no, but green's the fashionable color because that's the one they had to give women. It's just an odd detail maybe
the joke is, hey, you know what, blue would have been so obvious, we're going to do green, and then it's sort of a stealth corruption that we can all kind of wink at. Or
maybe the joke is the color doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter. It's just it's just that we've got you on our side now. That's all that matters. I don't know. So someone had asked, was green, was poisonous ultimately, and it was. And they had to change that. I think the green had the arsenic in it.
Arsenic, yes, yeah. Yes.
And that had to be changed later. But it was a very popular color early on because they had found a way to make it so much. So So then they get introduced to Perker introduces them to Mr. Pott. He's the editor of the Eatanswill Gazette, and he gets to he gets to talk to Mr. Pickwick. He lets him know that the press is a mighty engine, sir, said Pott, and he has never abused the enormous power I wield. I have never pointed the noble instrument which is placed in my hands against the sacred bosom of private life or the tender breast of individual reputation. I mean, he's just, completely full of hot air. And this is the way Dickens is portraying the editor of a newspaper while he is still a reporter for the Morning Chronicle. while he's writing the Pickwick Papers. This is the way he's portraying a newspaperman. Now you could get away, well, this is the small town newspapers. This is the way they operate, right? This wouldn't be the editor I work for in London. But Dickens doesn't seem to, think very much of political reporting, which is something he is still doing. Now he's off the road now, at least. He's not going around while he's doing Pickwick, I don't think, in covering elections, but he is in Parliament covering the one trial that's going on there right now in Parliament that I mentioned last month. He's still doing his political reporting. So
Orwell makes that comment about Dickens in that famous essay that he wrote on Dickens, Ed, that somehow Dickens was able to criticize with various degrees of savagery all these British institutions, yet he never alienated himself from, say, lawyers or doctors or in this case the press. He got away with it. It was something about him,
and likely because even when he's criticizing a profession, the things he's criticizing, people get it, and it's true. And probably even the people that are in those professions, like, you're right, that's if you wind up not liking him, you probably recognize that he's criticizing you, particularly like the way you practice something. So yeah, and Orwell, as it's interesting too, as a journalist himself, loving Dickens, and they're understanding how Dickens approaches his subjects, especially early on, in these kind of ways that he's doing it, where he's traveling around. He does this for several novels, where he's traveling around and getting ideas, much like a reporter does, much like a journalist does, and then expanding them in novels. And he's doing that right at the start here. Well, they need a place to stay. There's not enough beds in the town arms, and there's no beds in the town arms. And they find, but there are a couple beds in the Peacock, another place, and there's a couple, and Mr. Potts can put up two of them, and it'll be Mr. Pickwick and one of the Pickwickians with him. Who is it? Winkle, and Winkle will go to Mr. Potts' house to stay with their family, and Snodgrass and Tupman will go and stay at the Peacock with Sam Weller too. I might not. We go to the Potts home, and Mr. Potts, we get a little description of Mr. Potts' domestic circle. If he had a weakness, it was perhaps that he was rather too submissive to the somewhat contemptuous control and sway of his wife. And we got this very funny, exchange with the two of them, which is always like, she'll criticize him, but he'll still say, "P, my dear," said Mr. She'll say, "P, my dear," said Mrs. Pot. "My life," said Mr. Pot. And then she's a little bit tired of the life that they're having to live here, right? This kind of small town electoral life, editor, that she is ecstatic that these two gentlemen from London, from like the real world, their tiny town, have come to stay. She's very happy to have them there. And she sits down to play cards with Mr. Winkle, and Mr. Pot brings out his file of the Gazette for 1826 to read some of a few of the leaders. But unfortunately, we have in vain pored over the leaves of Mr. Pickwick's notebook in the hope of meeting with a general summary of some of these beautiful compositions. We have every reason to believe that he was perfectly enraptured with the vigor and freshness of the style. Indeed, Mr. Winkle has recorded the fact that his eyes were closed, as if with excess of pleasure, during the whole time of their perusal. So another little knock on political reporting in newspapers, right? So what a shame they're missing from these notes. Well, let's get to the election. The next morning, the noise and bustle usher in the morning, the beating of drums, the blowing of horns and trumpets, the shouting of men, the tramping of horses echoed and re-echoed through the streets, and an occasional fight between the light skirmishers of either party. Where do we want to hit this letters here? To vote. Yeah, let's go right into the Dickens in 1835, a year before this, was covering an election in Kettering up in the north. And let me open my letters here. Here they are. And he wrote a couple letters. This is before he's married to Catherine Hogarth. My dear girl, my dear Kate. But the first letter he writes, why don't you read that first? Just read that red. You don't have to read the whole thing. Did you get that? Did I sent you?
Yeah, I got that. Got it right here. To Catherine Hogarth, 16 December, 1835, White Hart, Kettering, Wednesday morning. My dear girl, you will see or hear by the chronicle of yesterday that we had a slight flare here yesterday morning, just stopping short of murder and a riot. Party feeling runs so high, and the contest is likely to be so sharp a one that I look forward to the probability of a scuffle before it is over. As the Tories are the principal party here, I am in no very good odor in the town, but I shall not spare them the more on that account in the descriptions of their behavior I may forward to headquarters. Such a ruthless set of bloody-minded villains I never set eyes on in my life. In their convivial moments yesterday after the business of the day was over, they were perfect savages. If a foreigner were brought here on his first visit to an English town to form his estimate of the national character, I am quite satisfied he would return forthwith to France and never set foot in England again. The remark will apply in a greater or less degree to all agricultural places during the pendency of an election, but beastly as the electors usually are, these men are superlative blackguards. Would you believe that a large body of horsemen, mounted and armed, who galloped on a defenseless crowd yesterday, striking about them in all directions and protecting a man who cocked a loaded pistol, were led by clergymen and magistrates? Or that I saw one of these fellows with my own eyes unbuckle one of his stirrup leathers and cut about him in the crowd with the iron part of it, communicating to the blows all the additional force that swinging it at the end of the leather could give them? Anything more sickening and disgusting, or anything that roused my indignation as much, I never beheld. I think I shall have to go over to Northampton today with the Times man, who's returned from a gentleman's seat in the neighborhood. Whether he went on business before I was up, I am in momentary expectation of. If so, I shall sleep at Northampton tonight and return here in the course of tomorrow morning. The polling begins on Friday, and then we will have an incessant repetition of the sounds and sights of yesterday till the election is over. Bells ringing, candidates speaking, drums sounding, a band of 8 trombones. Would you believe it? Blowing, men fighting, swearing, drinking, and squabbling, all riotously excited and all disgracing themselves.
It's exactly what we get in this chapter. And even has that line, right? This will all apply in a greater or less degree to all agricultural places during the pendency of an election.
What I like, Ed, is I look forward to the probability of a scuffle before it is all over. The attraction of repulsion. He wants
I like a band of 8 trombones, and in parentheses, would you believe it?
Would you believe it?
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing that he's covering and writing about, the fighting, the danger that's going on, the ruthlessness of these people and the way they would treat these crowds, and just get away with it because it's electioneering and this is what we do. He writes her the next day, or is the next day, or it's 2 days later, he writes her, from the White Hart and Kettering, Friday noon, my dear Kate. Part of that is the noise and confusion here this morning, which is the first day of polling. That's where we're at in the part right now. The first day of polling is so great that my head is actually splitting. There are about 40 flags on either side, 2 tremendous bands, 150 constables, and vehicles of every kind, sort, and description. These last mentioned nuisances are constantly driving about and in and out and up and down the town, conveying voters to the poll. And the voters themselves are drinking and guzzling and howling and roaring in every house of entertainment there is. Our house is so full, and the blue swine, or in other words, the conservative electors, are such beasts that we have retired into my bedroom, a large compartment at the extreme end of a long gallery with a couple of windows commanding an interesting view of the stable yard. There is a little passage leading to the room, at the entrance of which is a door which we have fastened, and on the outside of which we have affixed a poker as a temporary knocker. Here we have removed the bagatelle board, and here we sit secure from interruption with the bedstead wheeled into a corner. I have just ordered dinner in the curious den for 5 people, cod and oyster sauce, roast beef, and a pair of ducks, plum pudding, and mince pies. I include that last bit because I love that he goes into all the eating, and he does that in his fiction all the time too. And I want to eat with Dickens, right? I want to get trapped in a room with Dickens with cod and oyster sauce, roast beef, a pair of ducks, plum pudding, and mince pies. Let me tell you. He talks a little bit at another part in this letter. He says because they're going to escape, they're going to leave. And he says a driver was chosen by ballot, and your humble servant was unanimously appointed guard. We started at about 11 o'clock for the Duke of Buccleuch's seat, which is about 4 or 5 miles from hence. Went over the house, dined at a country public house, and returned after dark, when our driver, being very nearsighted and slightly overcome with potations of ale and egg flip, ingeniously drove the party into a water splash. The guard dismounted, the water being up to the calves of his legs, and after a great deal of dragging, splashing, and shouting, succeeded in leading the horse back to the road, and we all arrived here in time for coffee. Well, I had to include that part too, because we get like a little story from Sam Weller about which will attach to that as well. But this, behavior of a town, of a small town, when an election is going on, Dickens is not just inventing this for the Pickwick Papers. He has already covered this and witnessed it and written about it in letters in the past. And we see all that stuff going on here. Mr. Pickwick meets Sam in the morning. He says, they seem devoted to their party, Sam. Never seen such devotion in my life, sir. Energetic, eh? Uncommon. I never see men eat and drink so much afore. I wonder they ain't afeard of bustin'. And Mr. Pickwick says, that's the mistaken kindness of the gentry here. Very likely, replied Sam briefly. And then Sam tells him about he and 2 waiters at the Peacock has been pumping over the independent voters as supped there last night. Pumping over independent voters, exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. Yes, every man slept where he fell down. We dragged them out, and one by one this morning and put them under the pump, and they're in regular fine order now. Shilling a head the committee paid for that air job. Sam's getting paid to put the drunken people, man, under a pump to wake them up so then they can go vote. And then Sam tells him about this thing that happened at the last election. He heard the story about that happened in the last election. The opposite party bribed the barmaid at the Town Arms to hocus the brandy and water of 14 unpolled electors, as was a stopping in the house. What do you mean by hocusing? And Sam says, putting laudanum in it. Blessed if she didn't send them all to sleep till 12 hours after the election was over. So they would drug some of the opposing voters and then they would wake up after they couldn't vote anymore. Strange practices these, said Mr. Pickwick. And Sam says not half so strange as something happened to his father. And he tells this story, which I won't read all of, about his father who was bribed in a sense. Somebody come up to him and said, hey, you're a coach driver bringing the voters in. Isn't the road terrible? Imagine you could probably crash into the water on the way, right? And he's like, what do you mean? They're like, you could probably crash. And they give him money. And sure enough, he did. His coach goes off the road, and what a coincidence, Sam says. Can you believe it that it actually happened? And even jokes about how, one of the men may even have died. One
old gentleman was missing. They found his hat, but he's not sure if his head was in it.
Yeah. So.
Now, of course, the essence of satire is to exaggerate something, right? So, you read this as a modern reader, you think it's satire, but gee, it is pretty close to the truth, isn't it, Ed? And even
at least in his letters. Now, clearly Dickens loves to be, entertaining in his letters as well. But It's there. We've seen the stories, and Hogarth painted it too. Now, we're not talking the same time. We're talking 80 years previous. Hogarth is doing this, making the same kind of paintings. Why don't you share those paintings now that Hogarth made that you saw in Sir John Soane's collection?
Okay, so it's a series of 4 paintings. Can you see that now? The first one?
Yeah.
Okay, so this one is, let me just grab
an election entertainment.
Okay,
this is the pre-party then, right?
Election entertainment. So things to look at here are, you can see the buff banner here. So we know that this is the Whig Party inside. Outside the window, you can see a blue banner and a guy pouring the chamber pot down on the Tory adherents of the blue banner. And, I won't get into everything that's in this painting, but, one of the nice things about the painting, you get the color, right? So.
And it's a scene of debauchery is what it is.
It's a scene of debauchery. Yeah. And, Hogarth was famous for that. Now, the second one is called Canvassing the Votes. See if I can get that one on. Share it. Okay, and they're at an inn. You can see the British lion here is devouring a fleur de lis. You can see up here a couple of the local girls are flirting with the candidate here. Okay, and you can see over here, there's a mob storming this inn and a guy firing a pistol. This is supposed to be a Tory mob, Ed, and storming the Whig inn. Up here, you can see a candidate dressed as Punch, dispersing golden showers to people of money. Here you can see money pouring out of the treasury. And here you see this is actually the Horse Guards building on Whitehall, which was notorious for having a very low archway, sort of like that story that we heard from Jingle about the head of the household off. A lot of other details in there. I won't get into all of them. Now let me get to the third one, which is the polling place.
And then this will be interesting to look at this, because then we'll see Fizz's picture in a little bit.
So, right, this is the polling place. A few details here. So if you notice, here's the blue flag for the Tories, and here's the Tory candidate. Here's the buff flag for the Whigs, and here's the Whig candidate, and there's a beadle in here. You can't see him very well, but he fell asleep. You can see his staff of office up there. two lawyers are arguing whether or not this gentleman's hook suffices to bind his oath upon the Bible. This guy's kind of smirking at him. You can see he's only got one leg, a wooden leg here. Another one of Dickens' fixations.
And a hook for a hand. So this guy's likely a sailor here.
Right. And this guy is brought up. You can see he's at death's door, but they're getting him up there.
We're dead already.
Right. And then back to your story about the overturning carriage. Here is Britannia in a carriage. So the personification of the country riding along. She's getting upset in the carriage because you can see the two coachmen are gambling and drinking up on the box, and they're not paying attention. There's a riotous mob crossing this bridge. And pretty much everybody who's coming in to vote is sort of depicted as somehow being
that's great,
quote unquote, the dregs of society.
And you got to see these paintings.
This one's great. I really love.
Oh, there's another one.
This is the fourth one. Quickly share chairing the member. So traditionally, after you won, you were carried on a sedan chair through the town. And so here's the victorious member of Parliament with a satirical goose over him. It's based actually on a famous painting, Lebrun's The Battle of Arbela, a depiction of Alexander the Great with an eagle over his head. Here we have a goose over his head. Ed, can I read the quick poem that goes with this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just got to find it here. Give me a moment. Minerva's sacred birds and owl, our candidates behold a fowl, from which we would readily suppose, as now his generous honors chose, his voice he'll in the Senate use, and cackle like a goose. So silly goose he's got up there, and just some other stuff. You see the swine. This alludes to that parable when Jesus cast the spirits out of the possessed man and they rushed into the swine, as if the voters are just swine. You can see here, this guy swinging. They're battling here, this Tory and Whig adherent. He's hit the chair holder of the member. And so the whole thing is about to come toppling down, the whole rotten thing. Come toppling down. You got a memento mori here, and a lot of other stuff in here. I won't get into all the other details.
Well, I love how this kind of Hogarth's satire on elections is still in play, and we'll see Fizz's illustration of the scene that happens here in a moment. In the story here, they first they gather in the stable yard, the Eatanswill Blues with their army of blue flags, their great grand band of trumpets, bassoons, and drums. I'm really surprised he doesn't mention trombones. Constables with their staves, the 20 men, committee men with blue scarves, the electors on horseback. And remember how dangerous that can be in these mobs, as he was writing about in letters. The flags, the band's playing, they're squabbling. People are shouting, and then there were 20 washed men at the street door. They're telling Slumkey, the candidate, what he's going to have to do. There are 20, and this is uncanny. This still happens in elections. And this is like when at these election events now, these kind of details are still gone through, and like people are going to be there, and you greet them. It's a photo op, and you got to make sure you do all this stuff. 20 washed, but here, make sure they're washed. If you got to say that they're washed, they're usually not. There are 20 washed men at the street door for you to shake hands with, and 6 children in arms that you're to pat on the head and inquire the age of. Be particular about the children, my dear sir. It always has a great effect, that sort of thing. And if you could manage to kiss one of them, it would probably produce a very great impression on the crowd. Well, they come out, and we get the narration from Perker, as everything's going on. He has come out, he has shaken hands with them, and they cheer. He has patted the babies on the head, and there's a cheer. He has kissed one of them, and a cheer. He has kissed another. He's kissing them all. So Slumkey gets over enthused, just kisses all the kids, and then here we go. We're off to the more jostling in the procession here. Mr. Pickwick gets his hat knocked over his eyes and nose and mouth by one poke of a buff flagstaff. There's a tussle crowd of combatants. Mr. Pickwick being personally engaged in a pugilistic encounter, but with whom or how or why he is wholly unable to state. It's just pandemonium. Until the fat crier of Eatanswill commands silence from everyone. And then we, I even like this here. There is, where is it? As they get up here. Oh, well, first, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Winkle and Mrs. Pott are seated in a couple of chairs, waving their handkerchiefs on a roof across the street from them. And she waves they wave their handkerchiefs, and Mr. Pickwick kisses his hand to the lady, and then the crowd starts in on him. Oh, you wicked old rascal, looking after the girls, are you? Oh, you venerable sinner, putting on his spectacles to look at a married woman. I see him winking at her with his wicked old eye. Look after your wife, Pot. Oh, the fifth. And then there was a roar of laughter. And then Mr. Pickwick is incensed. His indignation was excessive, but he contented himself by scorching the mob with a look of pity for their misguided minds, at which they laughed more boisterously than ever. I think that was funny. And then silence, and then proclaim silence. And the criers, got the bells ringing, whereupon a gentleman in the crowd called out, "Muffins," which occasioned another laugh. And I was a little confused by that at first, but I think the joke was he was like, everybody got silent and he's yelling muffins like, I'm selling muffins, right? Is that what he's doing here? That's what
I get from that, like in the morning, street vendors would go throughout London and ring a bell and cry muffins, and like at the beginning of Nicholas Nickleby.
Yeah, it would be funny if like you were at something now and everybody got quiet for something, and then you were like, "Get your hot dog," everybody would laugh,
Right. So there you go.
At that moment. And then we get this kind of prolonged process of announcing the candidates with all these interruptions. The crowd gets boisterous. They start fighting. Here's where I want to show the fizz image here of the scene that's going on right now. And this is it. This is the way Fizz has illustrated it. A lot of action. Like, again, this is very Hogarthian, right?
Absolutely.
All these little details all throughout here. Here's the candidates up here on either side. Here's Mr. Pickwick.
And you've got your trombone player there.
We do have a trombone player down here, even though he wasn't mentioned in the text, I don't think, or maybe he was. I missed that part. They're fighting here with their staffs, the slumkey signs, and this must be a Fizkin here. Fizkin's over here. Just pandemonium happening.
And the pompous beetle up on top there. And with Pickwick on the right,
looking rather shocked at like this scene going on, like, as he probably should be shocked at this kind of, this is the noble patriotism, this is sturdy patriotism, right, of Eatanswill. But all these great details, people lying around. Guy's got one leg here too. He's just drunk. He wasn't in a fight. He's just drunk. But this is the scene, and not entirely unlike the scene in Hogarth, right? So that's it. All righty. Yes, they have this kind of back and forth to see who's going to speak first. And, every time Fizkin tries to talk, the band employed by Slumkey starts playing. And then they start struggling and pushing and fighting all the people outside. And Slumkey defies Fizkin or challenges him to mortal combat. And then it takes 3/4 of an hour for them to get all settled down after all this. And then they finally get to talk. And I love this. This is the summation of what they speak about. Fizkin expressed his readiness to do anything he was wanted. Slumkey, his determination to do nothing that was asked of him. So, hey, all right, we at least get a difference in there, right? Fizkin's going to do things. Slumkey's like, I'm not doing anything. And they both said the trade, the manufactures, the commerce, the prosperity of Eatanswill would ever be dearer to their hearts than any earthly object, and each had it in his power to state with the utmost confidence that he was the man who would eventually be returned. So there's no real difference in candidates. One's going to do too much. One's not going to do anything. There's your choice. They vote, and it is Slumkey is the first they have a show of hands, and then it's like, all right, because then somebody's like, oh, I declare a poll, so then the hands don't work.
Well, the mayor decides based on the show of hands in favor of Slumkey.
Yeah.
So you're thinking maybe he's on the take, the blues got to him,
Well, yeah, but then they call for, a poll, and then during the polling where everybody has to then go vote, everything was conducted on the most liberal and delightful scale. Accessible articles were remarkably cheap at all the public houses. Accessible articles, everyone, are things that people have to pay an excise tax on, like booze. That's what he's saying. The accessible articles are all very cheap right now at the public houses. And spring vans paraded the streets for the accommodation of voters who were seized with any temporary dizziness in the head, meaning they were getting drunk. An epidemic which prevailed among the electors during the contest to a most alarming extent, and under the influence of which they might frequently be seen lying on the pavements in a state of utter insensibility. A small body of electors remained unpolled on the very last day. They were calculating and reflecting persons who had not yet been convinced by the arguments of either party, although they had frequent conferences with each. 1 hour before the close of the poll, Mr. Perker solicited the honor of a private interview with these intelligent, these noble, these patriotic men. It was granted. His arguments were brief but satisfactory. They went in a body to the poll, and when they returned, the Honorable Samuel Slumkey of Slumkey Hall was returned also. Clearly, the small body of voters hold out so they can get what they want, and they do, right? So it's money, or it's a favor, or something they're taking behind the scenes. They're most likely just paid. It's most likely like, all right, you vote, here's some money, and then they go vote for Slumkey. So, because the argument was, Perker's arguments are brief but satisfactory. So, greasing the palms. So, I like how Dickens says all this without saying it exactly. And not that he's trying to be like secretive, like I'm not slandering them. He's just trying to do it in a way that's funnier, more enjoyable to read than just him coming out and slamming them and he bribes them and then they go and vote.
But you can't mention that word bribery, which looks ahead to, with Sir Lester Dedlock. I keep talking about Bleak House today. I'm sorry, but there's an election there, and his cousin mentions, well, why do you need all this money? And, he's like appalled. You just don't talk about it.
Well, you could mention bribery in the Pickwickian sense.
So, right. There you go.
It's always an out. Always. I'm just saying this in the Pickwickian sense. So. All righty. Chapter 14, comprising a brief description of the company at the Peacock assembled and a tale told by a bagman. What's a bagman, Kevin? People that don't know?
Well, like a traveling sales guy, he'd have a bunch of stock and go around, and cheap jack is another word for it, I think, like that famous story Dickens told about the cheap jack and the blind daughter. So yeah. And
I like them described as they're commercial travelers, in that they travel for commercial reasons to sell things, because Dickens, of course, writes a series of essays, sketches called The Uncommercial Traveler, because he loved to travel and right, but he does it in an uncommercial way, but he does it in a commercial way because I'm going to write about it and then sell that. And so, all righty. Well, and the tail. This is Tom Smart. Oh, I don't have my button. Oh, it's in the other room. My tag, my Tom Smart tag.
You left the house without your Tom Smart tag?
It's just in the other room here. But in the Pickwick Club in Philadelphia, I am Tom. We all get a name from the novel, and they're just randomly chosen. And I'm Tom Smart, who we'll meet here. So
does that moniker come with a lifetime supply of free punch, Ed?
It does not, but I wish it did. And you asked me earlier, like you thought I'd be drinking punch today because Tom Smart loves the hot punch, but it's too hot. It's the summer when we're doing this show, so it's just so that's why I'm drinking shandy gaffs all day, a little beer and ginger ale. Well, to finish this up, this chapter, Pickwick stays. Let's see, where are we at? Oh, Pickwick is with Mr. Potts here, and Winkle is taking little pleasant walks with Mrs. Pott. Tupman and Snodgrass are at the Peacock with Sam Weller. And there they have a bagatelle board. I mentioned Dickens mentions they bring a bagatelle board in his room in the letter to Catherine, and that's why I mentioned that. And there's a bagatelle board here. If you don't know what a bagatelle is, it's for people. It's like it's a board which you roll balls, so you try to get them in little holes on the board. And sometimes there's pins around them, and you try to like not knock them over or get the ball around them. Sometimes you just roll them in the holes that are worth certain values. It kind of is the precursor to pinball. It's what pinball becomes, and electronically or whatever. But it's a game they play, and Skittles, and they're playing Skittles here too. And Skittles is a little bowling game with little pegs that you knock down. It's kind of like miniature bowling. But it's done outside on grass, or it's done on a long board. It's sometimes internally in places. Here it's out in the garden, I think in the backyard.
Is that where Rip Van Winkle was playing Skittles?
They're 9 pins and nine
pins. Okay.
Yeah, they're related. I don't know which comes first.
Okay.
I think 9 pins becomes then Skittles is a more detailed, specific way of playing this, but it's basically a little bowling game with pins. And Mr. Weller, and they don't know how to play. They are far more abstruse about these. And Mr. Weller, who possessed a perfect knowledge of such pastimes. So it's Weller teaching the gentleman how to play these kind of pub games. That's what he's doing. Oh, this is So here, this is the conception of the novel in a sense. Even though Dickens doesn't make much of it here, but this is it. It's like these gentlemen from London going off to learn things, and what they're learning is how to play pub games. That's the joke of it. So that's their experience here traveling.
And of course, one wonders with all Dickens, rich guys, or gentlemen, like, how did they get to have money, without knowing any of this stuff? Their innocence abroad, they don't know, and much about life, but somehow they have money, I guess, or they've been able to avoid knowledge somehow and live in a state of innocence.
Well, there's a lot of smoking and drinking here. It even says inmates of the house smoking and drinking. And then somebody pipes up a stout, hale personage of about 40 with only one eye, a very bright black eye, which twinkled with a roguish expression of fun and good humor. This is the Bagman. There's and then they have this, they're all smoking pipes, which I love, but then they have this like, oh, women are strange, and like, oh, women are great, oh, you must not be married, and blah blah blah. Mr. Snodgrass takes offense, like that they're going to say anything disparaging about women. I repudiate it with disdain, with indignation. But the Bagman says, little argument about women brought to my mind a story I have heard an old uncle of mine tell. So, and then he tells us that it's 80 years ago, he says. And then we get the Bagman story, but it's actually the Bagman's uncle's story. Sometimes you'll see it referred to that as that. This is the Bagman's uncle's story. And I like this first line of it. It just says, and he used to tell it something in this way. So I like that little start to it. And we get this, it kind of conveys the idea that it is this guy sitting here telling us a story in the room at the Peacock. And it is one winter's evening about 5 o'clock. And the story is about Tom Smart, who is a commercial traveler himself, right? Traveling around, and he happens to be caught in a terrible storm. And it is, whoops, hold on. He's caught in this terrible storm. The rain is just awful, the rain and the wind, and he's just riding a horse out in the countryside, going from place to place. Go ahead.
Just to talk about the wind and so on. I mean, what I really love about this story is how, one of the things about Dickens is that, as Nabokov wrote in his lectures on literature, that, things participate, so the wind is a character in this story, it sort of has a mind, and as we see, so does the chair. It's not just an inanimate object. And and he finally, because the weather's so bad, he has to stop at this public house we're in. But this is like several paragraphs, and there are so many specific details about the storm, about his horse, story of what his horse is like. None of this has any bearing on the story that will be told. None of this detail matters in a sense that this isn't the story is about what happens to Tom Smart at night with the chair. Like, none of this ever gets referred to again, and it could all be done in one line, but that's not what happens when someone sits down and tells a story at in the public house or at the inn. You get all the details, all the very specific details, and Dickens is playing to that, and it lets him just go off and write whatever he wants. And we have that over and over again. And it's something that people dislike about reading, sometimes 19th century novels is, they write, yeah, they do. That's why I read it. I love all these directions. That's why when I talk about just 3 chapters of it, we go on for 2+ hours, because I want long form content. Dickens gives me long form content. That's what I want. So, and it's back to that Orwell essay again, in which he says the one great distinctive mark of Dickens' writing was the use of the unnecessary detail, Ed, so if you don't like Baroque, if you don't like Rococo, if you don't like a lot of angels and piled on detail, maybe it's not your style, but that's what you're going to get. You're going to get a lot of Baroque in Dickens. We do. And to just tell the details of the Tom Smart comes across this comfortable place, inn that he stays. It's a very comfortable bar. There's a widow who owns it, and he sees, and she's sitting there with this, tall man who's clearly courting her. I mentioned earlier the widows. There's a lot of widows in Dickens's fiction. I came across one reference, at least 38 widows appear in Dickens's fiction. And we've had 2 in just these parts here, Mrs. Bardell and this woman in the story with Tom Smart. And we know they're widows because Dickens tells us that they're widows, that it's a characteristic of this character that he's putting down there. And it's just a reminder that role that women had in life then, that widows could have financial, they could have social power. They're post-wives is what they are. They've already fulfilled their duty. I've already married, even if they've not had children, they've still married. And they're and Dickens has several instances where they're very attractive, like this one here. Now, it's partly the money and comfortableness that she has, and she has a successful business, and Tom Smart's imagining I could just be like sitting at the bar all day. But they're also attractive. They're sexually knowledgeable because they've been married. They can also be kind of dangerous figures too.
for people because they have a kind of power. But in this case, for this particular one, she's really attractive. And part of the attraction is that she's a little older, good looking, has money, owns this great inn, and that's very attractive to Tom Smart. So he's very envious of this tall man who's talking to her. He automatically imagines he wants to be with her. He's drinking a lot of hot punch. Turns out hot punch is his favorite. And he has glass after glass. Dickens himself was a great lover of hot punch, and had his own recipe. I make it every year at a program at the Rosenbach on our Drinking with Dickens in December, from Dickens's recipe. Dickens loved punch, and Tom Smart loves punch too. But the more he drinks, the more he's bothered by the tall man giving attention to the widow. He finally gets shown up to his room by the serving girl here. And
doesn't he sneak a smooch on the way up too?
Tries to, and sneak a smooch or sexually assault her. I'm not sure which way to describe it.
Well said.
And it is he's fond of hot punch. Yeah, he pretend the candle goes out, and while he pretended to be blowing it a light again, he was in fact kissing the girl. She quickly gets out of there. This is the case where he's taking advantage of someone. This is always a joke in Dickens, taking advantage of the serving girl. But what he really wants is the widow. But he goes into this room first, and what struck his fancy most was a strange, grim-looking, high-backed chair carved in the most fantastic manner, with a flowered damask cushion and the round knobs at the bottom of the legs carefully tied up in red cloth, as if it had got the gout in its toes. Of any other queer chair, Tom would only have thought it was a queer chair. But this one, Tom sits down before the fire and stares at it for half an hour. Damn the chair! It was such a strange old thing, he couldn't take his eyes off it. I love that it's constantly called a queer chair. It's all through here. It's a queer chair, a queer chair. That it is just this bizarre thing that he can't quite fathom. And Dickens is already doing what you said, Orwell, and what he always does is he animates inanimate objects, and it's like it's already got gout in its toes, like he's already describing. And then Dickens, though, in this instance, this doesn't usually occur, though. It actually does then come alive and become, a person. It becomes this old man. After Tom goes to sleep and then wakes up again, he says the carving of the back gradually assumed the lineaments and expression of an old shriveled human face. The damask cushion became an antique flapped waistcoat. The round knobs grew into a couple of feet encased in red cloth slippers, and the whole chair looked like a very ugly old man of the previous century, with his arms akimbo, and he's winking at Tom Smart. And then we're reminded that Tom had had 5 tumblers of hot punch. So while he's doing this, while he's seeing this vision here, there's no picture of it in the issue, but Fizz did do one later. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'll finish the story here, and then we'll talk about that. In any case, the chair tells him that he's been with the family a long time. His brother chairs are all gone, destroyed, and over the years. But he tells him that in the press there in the room, the dresser, the tall man has pants are in there, and he has a letter in the pockets that's from his actual wife and children who are still alive, hoping he'll come back to them. And then the chair transforms back into the chair, and Tom falls asleep. It's surprising that there's no illustration, that Fizz didn't do this, but if you're only doing 2 illustrations, you can't pass up Mrs. Bardell fainting, because it's a great scene, and also because it does become an important thing later in the novel, but we won't tell everyone why yet. And and the Eatanswill election. How do you not do that, crazy election polling scene? So this one's kind of left out. So what does the chair look like? Well, for the household edition of Dickens's work, published in 1873 and 74, after Dickens had died, Phiz did more illustrations, including the 5 more illustrations for the interpolated tales that weren't originally illustrated. And here is his picture that he did for this scene. And so this is Phiz's illustration. There's the queer old chair turning into this old man. This is Tom Smart in the bed here. I think it's kind of boring. I'm really like, let's get down. That's it. Nothing. It's very, very paneled up here. But it's just the chair itself. I find that, almost as if Phiz maybe did this quickly, because he wanted to add them to this. But not very inspiring for a Phiz. Certainly nothing like the early work that he had done, and the work he had always done. The one that I love in the Inner Sanctum edition that I have of this, which is illustrated all throughout, has this spectacular picture. There it is, of the chair. Look at that. That's just, and there's so many great illustrations in this by Frederick E. Banbury.
Really wonderful. Yes.
I mean, that's the picture of the queer old chair that I want to see. It's a little bit scary, and I get the whole transformation thing going on there. It's kind of like a nightmare of Beauty and the Beast, right? Like when all the animate objects become people, or people become, objects. Yeah, this one's really creepy. I like it a lot. So there's our queer old chair.
There was another one that Nash did, if you want to see that one.
I have it. You want me to show it? I'll show it. This is the one that Thomas Nast did for Dickens. I don't like this one. The chair just literally, it's like an old guy sitting in a chair.
It looks like a guy sitting in a chair, right?
Yeah. So this one doesn't thrill me either. He misses that kind of, it's too much of a person and not enough of, it's kind of a big head, and you get the idea that it's flattened out here, and the way the arms are a little, that's clearly off because your arms should go the other way. But, just kind of miss the, the effect here that I get in the story. And also, this is one of those instances where people argue against illustrating stories because the effect is in the words on the page. And so why would you then do the illustration for it? Well, for Dickens's early works, for these earlier serial works, it's part of it. People expect it and want it. And Dickens, as he goes through time, he's closely working with Phiz over illustrations and how he wants them and how he want to do them. And it really adds something to the text. And it's one of the reasons why we cover them here. But none for our first readers. They had to imagine the queer chair, as Dickens, does it, really well here. Well, morning comes, Tom opens the press, and look, there is a pair of pants with that letter in there. He shows the letter to the widow. There's a very melodramatic exchange between the two of them. Dickens at his, silly melodramatic best.
It sort of echoes Jingle talking to, trying to worm his way into in front of Tupman.
Yep. And that's the way this story kind of thematically connects. It's this story of a man trying to trick a woman, and someone has to come in and save her, and we've kind of already seen that. Again, it's another story with a supernatural or weird component to it that are always in the interpolated tales. It's never just it's not just a tale where the chair, like, you could take this tale away and have, you could just have Tom Smart find the letter in the trousers because he happens to be staying in that room. But no, Dickens has to throw in the supernatural moment. But there's an out because he could just be drunk. But then how did he know they was there? You know, it's like that whole question thing, which is fun. So he goes and he has this exchange with her. If, said Tom Smart, looking very shrewdly, if she marries again, when I do, I hope I have as good a husband as you describe. And, you know, and they go through this, the deception and villainy of the man. Frightful, my dear man, but compose yourself. Oh, I can't compose myself. I shall never find anyone else I can love so much. I mean, Dickens runs through this whole thing here. And the story ends, the Bagman ends the story saying that she looked up in Tom's face and smiled through her tears. Tom looked down on hers and smiled through his. I never could find out, gentlemen, whether Tom did or did not kiss the widow at that particular moment. He used to tell my uncle he didn't, but I have my doubts about it. Between ourselves, gentlemen, I rather think he did. And then he kicks the tall man out and marries her. And then this becomes very interesting here at the end. The tale's over, and then one of the men in the bar says to the Bagman, will you allow me to ask you what became of the chair? And read the Bagman's response there, Kevin.
Why, replied the old Bagman, it was observed to creak very much on the day of the wedding. But Tom Smart couldn't say for certain whether it was with pleasure or bodily infirmity. He rather thought it was the latter, though, for it never spoke afterwards.
Everybody believed the story, didn't they? Said the dirty-faced man, refilling his pipe.
Except Tom's enemies, replied the Bagman. Some of them said Tom invented it altogether, and others said he was drunk and fancied it and got hold of the wrong trousers by mistake before he went to bed. But nobody ever minded what they said.
Tom Smart said it was all true?
Every word.
And your uncle?
Every letter.
They must have been very nice men, both of them, said the dirty-faced man.
Yes, they were, replied the Bagman. Very nice men indeed.
I like the idea here. I would have ended the chat. If he had an editor, I would have said end it after every letter. Like, don't even the very nice man doesn't matter. Because what matters is that, hey, is this story true? Well, these people say it's true. These people say it doesn't. But what matters is Tom Smart said it was true. Bagman's uncle said it was true. The storyteller tells you it's true, then it's true. You know, it's that power of the storyteller here. You know, Henrietta mentioned that letter she sent to me about looking for instances of, you know, writers' implements or that kind of thing. But this is an instance, I think, of a writer saying, this is what storytellers do, and it's true. Like, you're not even supposed to ask about the reasons behind it and all that, because it's true that we tell you things that are true to life, and the kind of that you believe them is the power in them, that kind of emotional thing that goes on when you hear a storyteller. If you're not going through emotions reading something, then you don't believe it. But if you are, then it's true. You believe it in the moment. Of course, you believe that it's happening.
And that's that word too, Ed, I think that Dickens used to use, fancy.
Yeah.
The power of fancy, that was, you know, that the imagination to make that happen. That what's the phrase? That willing suspension of disbelief that constitutes poetic license.
Yeah. Well, it's all true here, everyone.
Every word of it, Ed.
We have it from Mr. Pickwick's notebooks. That's where this was put together from. His notebooks, that's all. Like, he discovered it, just like the stone that he discovered, that ancient stone. That's, you know, you could take Mr. Pickwick's word for it. Well, Pickwickians, thank you for joining us for number 5 of Pickwick Monthly. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on our Pickwick Travels. you will return in a few months after we run through all our other, co-hosts again. Coming up next month, my Pickwickian co-host will be Courtney Krolchek for issue number 6, chapters 15 to 17, in which we are treated with perhaps the greatest poem of the 19th century by Mrs. Leo Hunter. I cannot wait for that. The Pickwickians also, again, must thwart a scheme by Jingle, and Mr. Pickwick himself now recites a tale as the interpolated tale of the next issue. Mr. Pickwick himself will tell that story. Well, again, let me remind all of you to subscribe to our channel, to like these videos. You can support the Rosenbach through donation. Your support helps us create more programs like this and also care for our collections. You could also become a member. Membership gives you early access and discounts to programs and courses. You can find out more at our website. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me again.
Ed, thank you so much. Pure pleasure.
Always a pleasure with you, Kevin. Everyone, I am Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach Museum and Library. I'll see you all next month for number 6 of the Pickwick Papers. Bottle stands, pass it round, way of the sun through the buttonhole, no heel taps. All right, I still got a heel tap here to finish up when we're done. All right. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.